So, when all of you heard that the theme of today's event was serendipity, I'm sure a lot of you expected kind of optimistic, happy talks. Unfortunately, mine starts in a bit of a dark place, but I promise we'll get to the optimism later. But just to kind of set the stage right outright, our nation has a history with suicide. Now, when I say this word, I'm sure a lot of people in this room feel a bit uncomfortable. It's not a discussion that we typically like to have, but it's one that we do need to discuss. Now, as a nation, our suicide rates have actually been fairly stagnant over the past few years, but that is not truly reflective of the composition of those suicide rates. As a matter of fact, as this chart displays, between 2007 and 2014, adolescent suicide rates more than doubled. Now, this is immediately concerning when we think about the statistic, but it becomes even more alarming when we start to consider why this change might be happening. And one of the more interesting propositions that we have heard about is that media, and the way that media is incorporating narratives of mental illness into entertainment, can actually be perpetuating some of the negative stigma surrounding mental illness. Now, this is not something that a lot of people are aware of because in a lot of people's minds, representation equals improvement. And while most of the time that is true, the flawed representations of mental illness that often come through in entertainment not only fail to accomplish their positive goals, but actually perpetuate the problem that they claim to be solving. As a matter of fact, Stephen Hinshaw, professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, said that the worst stereotypes come out in such depictions. Mentally ill individuals as incompetent, dangerous, slovenly, undeserving. These portrayals serve to distance them from the rest of us. Ultimately, people with mental illness don't look to mental illness on the screen as something that is helpful. Rather, it serves to distance them from the rest of society. They view themselves on the screen as something that is a threat, something that is dangerous, oftentimes because of the flawed way that they are represented. And this actually comes through in a lot of forms of media. We all are kind of aware of the role that social media can play in suicide rates, particularly because of phenomena like cyberbullying, wherein people are oftentimes have their mental illnesses perpetuated by derogatory comments. But a lot of people aren't aware of the problematic extent to which media perpetuates mental illness. So I want to talk about a few examples outright that I think everybody in here will recognize and maybe kind of help you understand what I'm talking about. First, the M. Night Shyamalan film Split came out this past year. It did fairly well. It got a lot of really positive reviews, and many people said that it was one of the best films to come out in the year. But Split depicts one of the main characters, Kevin, as having DID, dissociative identity disorder, which is a disorder in which, in response to some type of trauma, an individual develops multiple personalities to help them cope. People with DID can be aggressive, but oftentimes they're just trying to work through their own trauma in their own way. In this film, Kevin's mental illness is used to justify his kidnapping and acts of violence against several individuals. And even at times, his transitions between personalities turn him into a physical monster. These representations of DID are obviously damaging because people living with that disorder don't like to think of themselves as monsters. They don't like to think that just because of the way that their brain chemicals are altered means that they are more likely to kidnap and murder people. But it goes beyond films. The Joker is a fairly well-known comic book character, also comes out in a lot of films. But specifically in a lot of comic book iterations, his acts of violence within Gotham, the Batman universe, are frequently blamed on his mental illness, even going so far in some iterations to say that he commits these large acts of violence because he's schizophrenic. Obviously, there seems to be some type of disconnect there, especially for people here in the audience that knows what schizophrenia actually looks like. People with schizophrenia are not mass murderers. Just because you have a mental illness doesn't mean that you are going to rig up a bomb to blow up a hospital. There's an obvious disconnect there that many members of the public don't see. But if you or somebody close to you suffers from schizophrenia, these representations hurt. But perhaps the most common and discussed problem that we see with entertainment media and mental illness is with issues of depression and anxiety. And a really great example of this is the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why. This show depicts Hannah Baker, a high school student who has committed suicide. She leaves behind 13 tapes for 13 people to tell them the role that they played in her suicide. Many people loved this show. It received great reviews, and its second season is coming out soon. Netflix, when they originally released it, championed themselves as mastering the art of mental illness representation. But as a matter of fact, what this message conveyed to people actually fighting against depression is that there are at least 13 good reasons to end one's own life. And that could not be further from the truth. We tend to think that media is just for entertainment and it can't really affect us. But unfortunately, for people that are dealing with issues that are portrayed in media, they will recognize the problems that a lot of us are content to ignore. And I'm unfortunately not just talking in hypotheticals. There have been a lot of cases recently that have been connected back to entertainment media, and I want to talk about two in particular. Priscilla Chu and Bella Herndon, both depicted here with their fathers. These images were taken a few weeks before these two high school girls took their own life. What is unique about these cases is that in both instances, in their last remarks or notes to their family, they mentioned 13 Reasons Why as one of the reasons that they committed the act. They thought that it showed that people really do care about you more when you're gone, that it is okay to commit suicide as long as it's for a meaning. That is a horrible lesson to be teaching our children. And these two people, Priscilla and Bella, they are not the only people that lost their lives because of this media representation. They're just the ones that made the headlines. It's even more concerning when we think about the fact that the rising suicide rates among adolescents could very well be tied to what we all consider to be great television and movies. Now, beyond just on a world scale, I do want to talk about why I want to have this conversation here, in this school, on this stage, and that's because of this. This is a KXAN article that came out recently that revealed that Lake Travis ISD students are more likely to consider suicide than the national average. To go into more detail, 170 students have contemplated suicide. That's 6% of our high school population, and 80 students have attempted it. To put that into a bit more perspective, the 6% that have contemplated suicide, that's 1 out of every about 16 students. Our average class size here at Lake Travis is 30, meaning that if you are a Lake Travis high school student sitting in this room, in any of your classes you have about 2 people that have contemplated suicide and about 1 that has attempted it. These numbers prove that mental illness is not something that we can ignore. It's not going to go away, and it's not something that only affects other people. Mental illness will affect the lives of just about everybody in America, whether you're going through it yourself or somebody close to you. And a lot of times these people don't know that they need to vocalize or ask for help. So we need to be the ones that are willing to have that discussion and challenge the stigma that perpetuates the violence that they have to undergo. So now let's get to the optimistic part. First, I want to point everybody to a really good resource. This is an organization called Rethink Mental Illness. Their website is rethink.org. It is a UK-based organization that holds petitions and events and fundraisers to try to challenge mental illness stigma, particularly in the media. I think this is a great organization if we are trying to fight against the media giants that we as individuals can't have much influence over. So I'd highly recommend everybody checks out this website. It's also just great if you're wanting to educate yourself a bit more about mental illness. But then that leaves the question of what can we as individuals do? Mental illness often seems vast and unknowable, but helping people around you that are suffering from mental illness is a lot easier than you may think. All that we have to do is be someone else's serendipity. It's like I said, people with mental illness often don't know or want to ask for help. They're ashamed. They think that they don't deserve help. They think that people don't care about them. But as I'm sure everybody in this room that has a connection to mental illness knows, people that are mentally ill are just as loved as anybody else, and they are just as deserving of help and care. We need to be willing to have this conversation. We need to not get uncomfortable when suicide gets mentioned into a microphone in a black box theater. We need to be willing to open up this discourse, and I would encourage everybody in this room to become more educated on mental illness, look for signs in those around you, and reach out for them and encourage them to get help. I want to end on a quote from an organization called Social Work Helper. They say that mental health awareness should not only be for a day or 2 or even a month. We must be informed about it because it can easily happen to someone close to us. Awareness does not just end here. Don't be scared to talk about it. It's hard work, but the power to reach and teach the community is well worth it. I want to encourage everybody here to try to be somebody else's serendipity. And I want to thank everybody for letting me try to start this battle here.